Anton Karas, the theme song from The Third Man, as you have heard every week for the last 5 years. I'm Randy Credico, live on the fly here in New York City. I got to tell you something. For the last 5 years, I've been wanting to do something on Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. I really have been dying to do something. And for some reason, I haven't been able to put it together until now. I finally got someone that can talk about it with authority. And that is the award-winning journalist, Michael Isikoff, who will be joining us in just a minute. You all know Michael Isikoff. He used to be with Newsweek, and he was the chief investigative reporter for NBC News, but he left because there wasn't enough investigative work that they wanted anyone to do. So we'll talk about that later on. But he's a great guy. And he's been involved with me. It's because of Michael Isikoff that I got drawn into the Russiagate affair. We'll talk about that maybe later on in the whole Roger Stone deal. But it's Mohammed bin Salman and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. That's what this is about. So he's got a great podcast, Conspiracy Land, in its third season. And this season, which started June 14th, focuses on Jamal Khashoggi, good and bad, the contradictions and his murder and NBS. It's really a fascinating series. I think they're up to number 5. But let me play the trailer for you, and we'll come right back with award-winning investigative journalist Michael Isikoff.
An international mystery with a growing demand for answers.
Khashoggi entered the Saudi consulate last Tuesday. His friends say they haven't heard from him since.
Jamal Khashoggi was his country's most prominent journalist, writing for one of America's premier newspapers. What happened to him inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul was shocking. But there is much more to the story that you've never heard, and one big question still outstanding.
There has not been any justice. I'm wondering why they killed Jamal.
The more one digs into his murder, the more it becomes clear. This was the result of a real-life conspiracy. There are new details from inside Saudi Arabia, never reported before, about how exactly Khashoggi was killed, pointing to accomplices still in the shadows. And it was directed from the top by Saudi Arabia's ruthless and all-powerful crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, otherwise known as MBS.
Are you saying that MBS is your SOB?
No, I'm saying he's the U.S.'s SOB.
And all this against the backdrop of a conspiracy of silence at the highest levels in Washington, while the Saudis gobbled up American weapons by the boatload.
$6 billion, that's for frigates. 889 million, 63 million. That's for various artillery.
And at the center of it all, a world-famous journalist whose career was marked by layers of contradictions and secrets.
If somebody sits across from you and tells you that Jamal told them everything, they're 100% lying to you. He kept all of it with himself, and he gave different people the things that they needed to know.
But when he starts to criticize the crown prince and plot ways to counter his repression, Khashoggi and his allies find themselves in the crosshairs of a global campaign of surveillance.
I think MBS saw it as a moment to brag, saying, yeah, it was us. We have our guy at Twitter.
There's a direct trail of blood drops from this hack to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
Coming June 14th, a new season of Yahoo News' Conspiracy Land, the secret lives and brutal death of Jamal Khashoggi. It turns out some conspiracies are real.
Okay, so when I heard that, and actually got to see it because there's a video of it, that trailer, man, that was so galvanizing that I started listening to the series, and it is a knockout. And Michael Isikoff, I congratulate you on this series. It really is a great piece of art, man.
Well, thank you, Randy. I think that's the first time you have congratulated me. So I will count that. Today is July 17th, 2021. And, milestones in my career.
Well, I have not congratulated you on your work. I did. I talked about the work you did.
Yeah, mostly you complained that I dragged you into the Russia thing, and
well, the expose on William Barr that you did way back in the 30 years ago.
Yeah.
that great story about how he somehow was able to come up with a legal opinion that allowed the U.S. to go in and snatch another foreign leader.
Well, interesting that you should mention that, because what we're talking about is a transnational action by Saudi Arabia that led to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And the best Saudi defense of that, which is not much of a defense, as we can discuss because it doesn't hold up, is, well, they actually were planning merely to snatch him, merely to kidnap him. And something went awry. For multiple reasons, that's not true. But it is part of this growing trend of transnational abductions and assassinations that we're seeing all over the world right now. And I think a lot of it is because when something so gruesome and egregious like the grisly murder of Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, when there are no consequences for that, when there's no sanctions against the leaders who authorize that, then it gives impunity to everybody around the world, whether it be the dictator in Belarus who wants to snatch a journalist from the sky, or Iranian intelligence operatives plotting to kidnap a journalist in Brooklyn. I mean, it's open season for authoritarian regimes around the world, and I think that's one of the important parts of the Jamal Khashoggi story.
Yeah, you know, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic did the same thing. He abducted a journalist in New York way back, I think it was 1959, 1960, and brought him back to the Dominican Republic and had him executed. So it's not, I know there's been a rash lately, but it's nothing new. This has been done before. But this story is really, what got you so interested? Did you know Khashoggi?
You know, I discussed this in, I think, episode 4 of the podcast. I had met him in Saudi Arabia back in 2002 when I was with Newsweek, and I went there for, in the aftermath of 9/11 to write about the political culture of Saudi Arabia that produced those hijackers who caused so much death and destruction in our country. And so I met him there. It was set up by the government, and he was very polite, very professional, but he was keenly interested in what I was going to write for Newsweek about his country. And I think that's a bit revealing, because for most of his career, he was a loyal Saudi. He was a journalist, but he also was a government operative. He was a spin doctor for the Saudi monarchy. He got hired by Prince Turki bin Faisal, who had been the chief of Saudi intelligence, as his media advisor when he became the ambassador to London and then later to Washington. Of course, his days with Prince Turki and Saudi intelligence go back much further to when in the 1980s, Khashoggi goes to Afghanistan at the invitation of his then good friend Osama bin Laden to cover the Mujahideen war against the Soviet infidels, as Jamal described them, who are occupying his country. And one of the things we did in this podcast, there's so many different elements that we could talk about, but there's a whole episode on Jamal and Osama. It's episode 3, in which we got these tapes that have never been played before of Khashoggi describing his dealings and relationship with bin Laden, from interviews that Lawrence Wright did back in 2005. Lawrence Wright shared them with me, and they're pretty fascinating to listen to.
Yeah. The name of the series, by the way, is Conspiracy Land. That's the name. You've had it for 3 years.
Right.
There are still a few more episodes left. People can get.
No, they're all out now. There's 8 episodes plus 2 bonus episodes. One about Khashoggi and the 9/11 lawsuit, and the other called "Training the Assassins," about the American company that trained the Saudi Tiger team of assassins that killed.
Well, you also wrote this incredible tome, opinion piece, or just an article, I think, in Yahoo News, that gives you a really good overview of that, of the entire affair, his entire life, basically. But so do you produce the show yourself? Do you write
Well,
All
I
the
write it, but we had a production company that did, I think, a bang up job in producing it. The editing and the music is really terrific. I should point out, you said this is the third season of Conspiracy Land. The first two seasons were dissections of bogus conspiracy theories, but this season is different. The tagline on this one, which is at the end of the trailer you played, is it turns out some conspiracies are real. And this was a real life conspiracy, not just to assassinate Khashoggi, but it was a worldwide web of surveillance that was conducted by the Saudis. They planted spies inside Twitter to steal personal data on regime critics. They bought this spyware, malware, Pegasus from this Israeli company, the NSO group, that was staffed with the hacking wizards from the Israeli Defense Forces.
They have penetrated. They have good relations with Israel, right?
Well, they, not publicly, but yeah, behind the scenes,
and Egypt.
there are relationships.
Egypt as well. In Egypt, we'll get to the Egyptian.
Egypt plays a big role in this story, yes, as we discovered. In fact, that's news we broke in this.
So let me go back to Twitter. The Twitter thing I found fascinating, and it's in your article. They actually were able to impale, the San Francisco headquarters of Twitter, and
they recruited two spies inside Twitter. One was the head of Middle East partnerships for Twitter, to steal the DMs, the IP addresses, the personal phone numbers of over 100 regime critics. And as we report in this series, MBS took credit for that. I mean, there's a Justice Department criminal indictment against the two Saudi spies who were recruited inside Twitter and stole proprietary information from Twitter. The guy who recruited those spies was the personal secretary to MBS. He's described as foreign official number one in the criminal indictment. MBS is referred to himself, Saudi royal family number one, in this pending Justice Department criminal indictment. But it goes beyond that. MBS tells an associate after all this broke, hey, that was us. We did that. We have our guy at Twitter. And so there you have MBS's fingerprints on a criminal scheme to steal information from an American social media company for the purpose of silencing regime critics.
Is he under investigation for that? I mean, is there an open?
I mean, look, there is this thing called, immunity for foreign officials. If he's a head of state, you can't indict him. But when you look at the indictment about the Iranian intelligence operatives just a few days ago about their plot to conduct surveillance and then abduct this Iranian American journalist living in Brooklyn, the parallels with what happened to Jamal Khashoggi are so striking. The surveillance, the plot to get him. In the Saudi case, it goes beyond abduction. It's grisly murder. But in one case, the U.S. Justice Department brings criminal charges. In the other, the Saudi case, it does not.
Well, they did do that. I'm going to go back to your article on Bill Barr did find justification to go in and abduct the leader of a country. So that did what he do back then, was that illegal, or has that been that rationale, legal rationale, has that been struck down?
Well, it's a different issue. That was, I think, snatch authority relating to Noriega, who was a head of state, who we were going to war with, per the decision by President George H.W. Bush, the invasion of Panama. So, at some point you get into national security, foreign policy issues, and it becomes a little murkier. I mean, the question was, if we went in with U.S. military troops and seized Noriega, could we bring him back to the United States to face trial for drug trafficking? He was under indictment by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami for drug trafficking and was ultimately tried for that.
Yeah. So, and he was muzzled for the next 30 years until he died. I think he had a lot of state secrets, U.S. state secrets, because he was a very well connected guy with the CIA. And
right. But we're talking about the Saudis today.
Yes, I want to get back to the Saudis here in episode one. In episode one, his bride to be, he wasn't yet married.
He wasn't yet married to his Turkish fiance. He had gotten married to another woman 4 months earlier in a Islamic ceremony performed by an imam in Northern Virginia. That you can hear the story of that in episode 7. It's a tale of two women.
So that's amazing. So he marries one and then he divorces her right away?
No, he doesn't divorce her. He just doesn't tell her about the other woman.
Oh, I see. But he went to the Saudi embassy in Istanbul on October 2nd,
correct,
2018, ostensibly to get papers that would invalidate the marriage or annul
the marriage to his wife in Saudi Arabia.
Right. That's what I meant.
Not the woman who he had married, the flight attendant he had married in the United States.
4 months earlier. So
4 months earlier. Yeah, exactly 4 months earlier. June 2nd was the religious ceremony in Northern Virginia. October 2nd was the murder.
Sounds like somebody from Utah, you know?
Yeah, look, Khashoggi was a very complicated guy who had a lot of secret lives, hence the title of the podcast, The Secret Lives of Jamal Khashoggi, and the secret lives and the brutal death of Jamal Khashoggi, because what was done to him was unbelievably brutal and gruesome.
Yeah, well, it just, I want to just play this one, this short clip here on the day that is the bride to be, that
yes.
He needed this piece of paper from the Saudis so it would be recognized in another Muslim country, which is Turkey, right? So he was going to marry her there. She's waiting outside. And this is what she says when she's waiting outside. This is from the very number one of Conspiracy Land on Yahoo News by Michael Isikoff. This is very moving, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
And I call them inside the consulate. I get number from the internet. And I call them to ask about Jamal. And I ask him, I'm waiting in front of the doors. My name is Hatice. I am fiance of Jamal. Where is Jamal?
Where is Jamal? That was the simple plaintive question that Hatice Cengiz posed to a security guard at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul late on the afternoon of October 2nd, 2018. A soft-spoken Turkish graduate student, Hatice was the fiancée of the famed Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. She had accompanied him to the consulate that day and waited patiently for hours while he went inside and never came out. Moments after she posed her question, the security guard emerged to question her.
He came out, yeah. And he asked me who you are, again the same questions. But he was really fear in his face. He shocked. And then he told me there is no one inside the consulate.
What's going through your mind?
Scared a lot. And then I felt my body is colder, and my heart was racing. And then I sat down a little bit to understand what he said. What can I do now?
What Hatice didn't know is that when Jamal walked into the consulate that day, a team of Saudi assassins had been waiting for him, armed with lethal drugs and a bone saw.
Can you pronounce her name correctly?
Hatice Cengiz.
Would you pronounce that again?
Hatice Cengiz.
And she was from where? Where was she?
She's from Turkey. She was from a small town in Turkey. Yeah, she was an academic, a graduate student.
So obviously you sat down with her afterwards because I
yes.
interviewed. And was that difficult to have a conversation with someone who lost her husband in such a brutal fashion?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, she has done a number of interviews, so she's used to it up to a point. But yeah, it's emotionally gut wrenching. And what's so fascinating, I mean, and really appalling about the whole thing is she's describing, going with Jamal Khashoggi to that consulate, waiting patiently outside for him, expecting that he's only going to be there to pick up these documents and come right out. And what we know, and if you listen to the rest of that opening episode, episode 1, minutes before Khashoggi walks into that consulate, the Saudi Tiger team of assassins are talking about what they're going to do to him. They refer to him as a sacrificial animal. They discuss how they're going to carve up his body after they assassinate him and put them in plastic bags. All this is about as powerful evidence of premeditation as you can imagine. They're talking about it, and we have this incredible narrator for this, Agnes Calamard, who was the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Killings, who did the most authoritative public investigation into Khashoggi's murder, and she was granted access to the Turkish audio tapes in which these discussions are picked up, and there they are. There is the evidence of a premeditated, state-sponsored assassination in black and white.
Wow, it really is fascinating. I can't imagine how much research you put into this, and there's a lot more. We'll be back after a quick music break. All right, we are back. We are back with Michael Isikoff talking about the gruesome murder of Khashoggi. I know you barely knew him, but this case is so interesting. How come there's not, like international outrage still? I mean, it seems like it has quieted down up until what you've done. I think you've rekindled interest and outrage in this case. Was that your point? You wanted to do that?
Well, look, you were starting to ask me before what drew me to do this. Why did I want to do it? And this what happened to Khashoggi got enormous attention at the time. It was a huge issue. It was a huge issue for the Trump White House, and episode 8, Anatomy of a Cover-Up, deals with how the Trump White House dealt with this and did indeed cover the whole matter up. But just looking on its face, this was, treated as a national security issue, a foreign policy issue. What should be our policy towards the Saudis? How do we deal with them when they do something like this? They're a US ally, but they engage in these most brutal of human rights violations. And I just sort of looked at it as a murder and how much we don't know. There was no real investigation. Agnes Calamard did the best she could with the evidence that was available, and she had access to the Turkish audio tapes. That's good.
But wait a second. The Turkish audio tapes, were they eavesdropping?
Yeah, they had bugs inside the Turkish consulate, and that's how they knew what happened to Khashoggi.
Have you heard those tapes?
I'm sorry?
Have you heard all the tapes?
I have not heard the tapes. They have not been publicly released. They have been shown to selective spy agencies around the world shared with them, including the CIA, and they were played for Agnes Callamard, but they have not been played in a public setting, and no journalist has heard them. But, that said, just back to the point I was making, like, okay, we know these assassins did this, right? We know Khashoggi, they murdered Khashoggi. We know they flew into Riyadh that morning of October 2nd, after a stopover, by the way, in Cairo, to pick up the drugs, the lethal dose of narcotics that were injected by a Saudi Ministry of Interior doctor into Khashoggi's left arm within minutes after he entered the consulate, killing him.
They were laying in wait for him, right? They were.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's what they were doing. But who ordered it? What were the instructions? What was known by the higher ups? We know that this Tiger team of assassins met with the right-hand man of MBS, Saud al-Qahtani, the enforcer, the henchman, as we call him in episode 1, just before they left. And we're told this guy, Khashoggi, is a threat to Saudi national security. We know that. What communications did MBS have with his right-hand man and enforcer who directed that Tiger team? There was a Saudi trial. It was a sham trial. It was a closed door trial. No press allowed, no human rights monitors allowed, no public record exists. No names of the defendants were released by any Western standard. The trial is absurd. But the Saudi prosecutors, laid out the evidence of the murder, including the Cairo stopover, including the intel guy who on the ground says it's too difficult to bring Khashoggi home, we'll just kill him. Nothing about what was said to Saud al-Qahtani. He's not questioned. Nothing about what Saud al-Qahtani says to MBS, even though the members of that Tiger team 7 of them were members of MBS's personal security detail. They were his people,
right,
who did this. And so, you look at it as a murder and it's like, wait a second. The guys who ordered this, the guys who are most responsible, were never even questioned, much less charged and convicted. And serving any time for what was really a heinous murder. And that's the reason I wanted to tell this story in all its in all its glory for what
we are talking with Michael Isikoff. The name of the show is Conspiracy Land. And what's the exact address that people can go to?
I think you just type in Conspiracy Land. It's an Apple podcast, it's Acast podcast, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, as they say.
You mentioned the stopover in Cairo, and we talked
middle of the night stopover.
On the way.
On the way.
All right, so they stopped there, and we're not sure if the representative for Sisi knew what was going on, what the drugs were going to be used for. But that's where they accessed these potent drugs with, a large enough dose would be fatal. But this person had it. They're illegal everywhere. But did Sisi know about it?
Yeah, well, excellent question. What we do know, and this is episode 4, which is the story of the Arab Spring, is the Saudis put Sisi in power. I mean, Sisi seized power in a coup in 2013, overthrew the elected government of Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood guy, who had been elected president. And the Saudis backed the coup to the max. They poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Sisi's regime, propped him up. As we also reported, they relied on Egyptian intelligence when they had earlier abductions to do. There's a Saudi prince who was abducted in Italy with the help of the Egyptians. So you put that together with what we discovered is you take the tail number of the Gulfstream jet that flew the assassins to Istanbul, you put it in the plane finder app and you see that for that flight in the middle of the night, there's a stopover in Cairo. And then we got the record of what the notes taken by Turkish embassy observers who were allowed to sit in on that sham Saudi trial. And one of the things the prosecutor said, per the Turkish embassy notes, which had never been reported before, is that Dr. Tubagi, the Saudi government doctor who's on that plane, injected the drugs that he picked up in Cairo for the purpose of killing Khashoggi. So you put the stopover in Cairo together with what's in the record based on these Turkish embassy notes, and you know that there were accomplices in Egypt who supplied the lethal drugs that killed Khashoggi. Who were they? Who's been questioned about that? Who can identify where Dr. Tubagi got those drugs at the airport? You know, maybe there were Saudi operatives at the airport. Maybe they made a quick run to some CVS in Cairo, or maybe it's something more sinister.
So also in episode 5, I want to play a clip from episode 5.
Which is one of my favorites, by the way.
And there's a clip in here, the buildup and the expectations of Mohammed bin Salman were high. I mean, this set it up. He was like, he got the gig. He got the gig. What was his gig when he first started working for the government?
His father names him the defense minister, right. and the very first thing he does is start this barbaric war in Yemen against the Houthis with bombardments of slaughtering thousands of civilians. But what's so striking, and this is episode 5, it's called the Rise of the Bullet Guy, is he's being celebrated by the foreign policy elite of the United States, top officials in the United States government. Obama's ambassador to Riyadh talks about how he would go in and yuck it up with the MBS and laugh and talk about everything under the sun. And then I think you're setting up the iconic
opening. It's a very opening of that one.
Yeah. Let's listen to it. I don't want to spoil for your listeners.
I think we're going to play that. This is episode 5 of Conspiracy Land, season 3 on Jamal Khashoggi and his murder. We're going to play this little segment, 3 minutes worth. It's worth listening to, and we'll be right back with the great Michael Isikoff. There's another compliment.
June 13th, 2016. Secretary of State John Kerry is hosting a Ramadan dinner at his home in Georgetown for a special guest from Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS as he's commonly called, then the country's new defense minister. A tall, bearded man wearing a sports coat and slacks instead of the traditional white Saudi thobe, MBS notices as he's walking in the grand piano in Kerry's living room. After America's top diplomat gives his consent, the Saudi visitor sits down and proceeds to start playing, much to the astonishment of the assembled guests, the Moonlight Sonata by Ludwig van Beethoven.
I was just, watching him show considerable virtuosity on the piano, on the keys. I mean, we were all surprised. Somebody had trained them well.
Musical performance by the Saudi prince that night was just one element in an extraordinary charm offensive that wooed American diplomats, members of Congress, business leaders, Hollywood moguls, and journalists, and shaped a narrative that quickly took hold, that this new young man was a breath of fresh air in the Middle East, a charismatic and cultured reformer who would bring his country into the 21st century. It was a narrative that at that point more than impressed the Secretary of State.
He's the only person I've met in 30 years of my involvement or more with Saudi Arabia who has put that kind of a vision on the table for the transformation of the country.
But MBS's heralded swing through the corridors of American power was also a diversion, masking a Mr. Hyde side to this new Saudi Dr. Jekyll. For just as Western elites and American officials were showering MBS with praise, there were already brief glimpses of much darker impulses. He had launched a barbaric war in Saudi Arabia's southern neighbor, Yemen, that through a relentless wave of bombing raids was slaughtering innocent civilians by the thousands.
More than 1,000 people have died since the Saudi-led bombing campaign began in late March.
And he would soon initiate a brutal crackdown against internal dissent, imprisoning and torturing activists, locking up members of the royal family, compiling a blacklist of perceived enemies, and ultimately sanctioning in the most grisly of fashions the execution of the country's most prominent journalist.
The CIA has determined that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ordered the assassination of Khashoggi.
He goes in there. He's really, John Kerry's like in love with him. And, looking back,
right?
Were they totally shocked? I mean, he was very gifted at building relationships with people.
Oh, look, he went on these charm offensive tours in the United States where he meets with, diplomats, U.S. government officials, senior journalists, Washington Post, the Atlantic Magazine, New York Times. He goes to Silicon Valley and meets with Jack Dorsey, whose company he had just stolen blind with that Twitter plot we talked about a little while ago. Ari Emanuel, the Hollywood super agent, everybody's just, lavishing praise on MBS, meeting with him, thinking about all the great investments they can do in Saudi Arabia. And yet there were red flags from the beginning. I mentioned the war in Yemen, which was a pretty big red flag right off the top, but there was other stuff about MBS.
Domestic repression. Talk about some of
I mean, look, he's arresting, detaining activists left and right. We talk about this woman, Loujain Al-Wathul, this charismatic, wildly popular women's rights activist who is, her car is surrounded in the UAE. She's blindfolded, flown to prison in Riyadh and tortured under the personal supervision of Saud al-Qahtani, the right-hand man of MBS. He's supervising the torture. And what does he say? He threatens to murder her. He threatens to rape her. And he says, I will cut you into pieces. Words that, loom large when you discover what happened just a few months later to Jamal Khashoggi.
So, and then all of the executions that take place.
Right. And yet, I come back to how, America's foreign policy elite were still celebrating. Thomas Friedman of the New York Times is talking, he interviews MBS 3 times and says, if he wasn't invented, he would have to have been, if he wasn't in power, he'd have to be invented because he's the one man who can save Saudi Arabia. You know what it reminds me of? You'll appreciate this. Walter Duranty. Remember Walter Duranty, the New York Times correspondent in Moscow, who lauded Joseph Stalin and dismissed the counts of the Ukrainian famine. I mean, it's an example of how, Western journalists often fall in love or fall for foreign policy, foreign despots. And
there was a London Times reporter, I forgot his name, that fell in love with Hitler back in 36.
Yeah, well, there were plenty of those, right?
Yes. But getting back to Khashoggi. So everybody knows he did it, and the CIA has
MBS.
Everybody knows that MBS has done this,
right?
But he's implicated only implicated, but not legally implicated. Like the last two presidents have given him a pass.
Right.
Trump gave him a royal welcome, and he signed a big contract and sold a lot of weapons. Is this all about? Is it all about selling weapons?
Arms for oil. That was the core bargain that was struck by FDR and King Ibn Saud aboard the USS Quincy in the waning days of World War II. And we go into that in episode 2. It's called The Arms Dealer's Harem. But it's the continuous theme in U.S.-Saudi relations. They'll let us extract their oil, we'll provide security, and sell them weapons. And by the way, also in episode 2, one of the supreme ironies of this is nobody did more to nurture that arms for oil bargain than Jamal Khashoggi's own cousin, Adnan Khashoggi, the arms dealer. He's the arms dealer referred to in The Arms Dealer's Harem, the title of the episode. But in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, he was the most conspicuous public face of Saudi Arabia, this like billionaire playboy with the super yacht. He's celebrated on lifestyles of the rich and famous. When he gets into trouble, of course, he sells that yacht and it ends up in the hands of one New York real estate developer who you might be familiar with by the name of Donald Trump. Trump, and then Trump touts the Khashoggi yacht. But just continuing through, and by the way, and that starts the financial spigot that goes from the Saudis to the Trump organization, which, as I say in the episode, is as significant as the Russian money that poured into the Trump organization.
What about Jared Kushner? What was his role?
Jared Kushner was buddies with MBS. They would exchange WhatsApp messages all the time. But just to complete my point about the arms dealers, in March of 2018, MBS comes to the White House. He's welcomed, and Trump celebrates all the arms deals that the Saudis are making, how much they are buying from US defense contractors. And he has poster boards and he's just boasting about it. Here's the frigates, here's the tanks, here's the airplanes the Saudis are buying. And when the Khashoggi murder happens, just a few months later, and Trump is under pressure to do something about what the Saudis have just done to a US resident. Khashoggi was living in exile in the United States at the time, writing for an American newspaper, the Washington Post. Trump refuses, and why? What reason does he give? Look at all the weapons they're buying from us. Look at those arms dealers. I'm not going to disrupt our relations with Saudi Arabia and disrupt those arms dealers. So Trump made the arms deals front and center. Yes, they've been going on since the days of Franklin Roosevelt, but no president had made them the centerpiece of our relations with Saudi Arabia. And then, Biden, let's just talk briefly, during the campaign, he said, I'm going to make the Saudis pay a price for Khashoggi's murder. I'm going to make them pariahs. He releases this skimpy report in February that, did pin responsibility on MBS, but no details in that, and no new sanctions against MBS or any senior level Saudi official. And what happens just before the release of that report? Biden's Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, calls his counterpart in Saudi Arabia, the defense minister of Saudi Arabia, i.e. MBS. What's the purpose of the call? According to the Pentagon readout, to reaffirm the strategic partnership between the United States and Saudi Arabia. So much for making the Saudis a pariah.
Well, and he did sanction a few officials.
But I mean, so did Trump. Lower level folks. Right.
Why not? What would have been the repercussions if they had sanctioned bin Salman?
Well, they did not want to disrupt the U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia. As always, there's other things that are considered. Other factors that when you when this grinds through the foreign policy grinder, right? Well, we need the Saudis to help with, the Palestinians, or we need the Saudis as a bulwark against the Iranians, or we need the Saudis' help in Syria against ISIS. There are always things that can be pointed to for reasons not to do what you've said you're going to do during the campaign.
Well, couldn't they at least say, look, it's contingent. These weapons are contingent in staying out of Yemen because it is a massive humanitarian crisis.
Oh yeah. And we talk about that in that same episode 5. I mean, just the slaughter of innocent civilians in Yemen by the Saudis, has created one of the great humanitarian disasters of our time. No question about it.
We're talking with Michael Isikoff. It's such a fascinating show. Did you do any research on the history of the House of Saud? Did you go back?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I tried to do in this series was put the Khashoggi murder in the context of the history of U.S.-Saudi relations, and that's why we go into it starts in episode 2 with the waning days of World War II and the meeting between.
But previous to that,
well, I didn't go. It's not a full-fledged history of Saudi Arabia.
No, I'm just talking about after World War I and the creation, I guess, of Prince Faisal. Elevated.
Yeah, right. Well, Ibn Saud, who is a character in episode 2, he is the father of modern Saudi Arabia. He united the country in sort of a bunch of brutal wars among the various tribes and turned it into a country. But it was an absolute monarchy. I mean, you'll enjoy actually if you get to it, the opening of episode 8.
That's what I want to talk about.
Yeah.
The House of, what do you call it? Harem.
No, Arms Dealer's Harem. That's episode 2. No, episode 8 starts out with a moment in history, 1962, when King Saud, the son of Ibn Saud, a notoriously corrupt monarch who had something like 27 palaces and over a harem of over 100 women, comes to the United States to recuperate from medical surgery. He goes to Palm Beach. JFK, John F. Kennedy, is president. He meets him there, but Kennedy is troubled. Kennedy is troubled by the Saudis. Why? Because in the early 1960s, they still practiced slavery. Slavery was legal in Saudi Arabia as late as 1962. And for Kennedy, this is a problem. He's under pressure to have civil rights legislation at home. We're in the midst of a Cold War cast as a clash between Western freedom and Soviet slavery. And here's an American ally that openly practices slavery. There were over 100,000 slaves in Saudi Arabia at the time, most of them Black Africans who had been trafficked to Saudi princes. And Crown Prince Faisal, who's the rival of King Saud, comes shortly after King Saud's visit to the White House, and Kennedy says, look, you got to do something about this slavery business. This is really untenable. And the Saudis, Crown Prince Faisal, agrees, and they abolish slavery. As Bruce Rydell, the former CIA analyst, says, the Saudis moved from the 7th century to the middle of the 19th century because of America. That's one instance of the United States putting human rights at the forefront of its agenda with Saudi Arabia, but it's happened very
what about now?
Very rarely.
You have foreign workers there.
Yeah.
And they are mistreated horribly, right? From Sri Lanka and other.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Bangladesh, Pakistan, all that.
Yeah. Wow.
It's quite a country, and it's quite a saga. I mean, the whole saga, and Adam. We go from there in the last episode to Anatomy of a Cover-Up, where I have my interviews with John Bolton, which is quite fascinating.
He called them our SOB.
He's our SOB, yes,
Yeah.
MBS is.
Yeah.
He also talks about, right after the Khashoggi murder, he and Jared Kushner together call MBS. They call him up. And I said, well, did you ask him? Did you do it? I said, no, we didn't ask him that because I didn't know where Trump was headed at that point, and I'm not going to,
undercut him.
Yeah, I'm not going to undercut the president. So they just say, get the story out, help, they talk about how to spin it, but not to get the facts. Now, Trump actually, and this was pretty interesting account from an NSC official who monitored his own calls with MBS and King Salman. Trump is fixated on the bone saw because U.S. intelligence has picked up. They brought a bone saw on the plane from Riyadh to Istanbul to carve up the body after they murdered Khashoggi.
Murdered him. They weren't just going.
I said before, the evidence that this was premeditated is overwhelming. It's not, it's not incidental. And Trump keeps asking, so was there a bone saw? Was there a bone saw? Tell me about this bone saw. I've been in a lot of negotiations in my life, but I've never had to use a bone saw. Hey, Mike Pompeo, he says, who's on the call. Mike, have you ever had to use a bone saw in negotiations? No, Mr. President, I've never used a bone saw. They were kind of joking about it. But at the end of the day, Bolton says Trump knew that MBS did this. He knew that this went to the highest levels of the Saudi government, but he had other items on his agenda, in particular those arms sales. He was worried that if we didn't sell those arms, the Russians would do it, right? And so he was going to stick with the Saudis regardless of their fingerprints on this horrific crime.
All right. Well, any final words? I mean, looking forward, this series, what can it accomplish in the future? I mean, what are you hoping for?
Well, look, I just think the story
resolution that is positive for those of us who are upset by this.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, first of all, it's just, one hell of a story. I mean, it's just unbelievable, intersection of true crime and foreign policy and corruption and money and power and wealth. It's all in this sort of one story of Jamal Khashoggi. But, beyond that, I mean, there are still, like I said before, I did my bit and put out as much as, I could put out there, and I think advanced the ball quite a bit, but there's still no real investigation. There's been some talk about creating some sort of Saudi Truth Commission, like they did in South Africa, to really get to the bottom of what happened. But it's highly unlikely because MBS is ruthless and all powerful. His father is not going to be with us forever. He's 79 years old, I believe, at this point. So MBS is the future of Saudi Arabia, and he's a cold-blooded murderer.
Right. And we didn't talk about his personal harem, but I would imagine from the rumors that I've heard that, pretty sick. Maybe they're not true.
Yeah, well, I like to stick to what we know is true.
Yeah, I don't know, but you do hear things. You do hear things. I don't know if they're true or not.
Yeah.
So there's no way of finding out. It's a very secret society and always has been.
Yes. All right. Well,
first of all, I want to thank you, Michael Isikoff. It's a fascinating, really compelling, cogent series. I'm at episode 5.
Keep going, man. There's lots more to listen to. They get better as you go along.
Listening.
They get better. They get better as you go along.
And they got 2 bonus episodes. So go find it. It's Conspiracyland season 3, and it's the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Thank you for your great work. It deserves a Pulitzer Prize. And a
okay, I'll just take the praise from you. That's enough praise for me today, right? Okay.
And we didn't even talk about Roger Stone.
Next time, man.
Okay.
Next time.
Michael Isikoff, it's been fascinating. Thank you. Keep up the good work. That's it, folks. We're going to close with some wonderful music here. I don't know what, but somebody is going to play some music when this is over with. All right? Michael, you can pick it. All right? Whatever music you want, we'll put it on. Tell me what you'd like to close with. What music do you like?
What would I like to close with? Oh, you're really putting me on the spot here. Oh, close with the Moonlight Sonata.
All right, we'll play.
How about that?
I've got that all set
for MBS throughout the podcast. So play that.
All right, we're gonna play. We're playing out with Moonlight Sonata by the player Nils Melzer. Thank you very much, Isikoff, and we'll talk to you soon.
Anytime.